Song that we sang, but gave him up for us. Lord, bring us to the place, grow us, sanctify us, make us like Jesus, bring us to the place where we have that kind of love for you, where we love you with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. For your glory, God, in Jesus' name, amen. Kids can be dismissed if you are going to junior church. Turn your Bibles, please, to Matthew chapter 16 is our text this morning. I'm always amazed at about 9:29, 9:27. Well, we got a really small group this morning, and then people start to trickle in. And with a good-sized group. Praise the Lord for that. And excited to share God's Word with you this morning. Excited about, thank you, praise team, for listening to the Holy Spirit. For listening to the Spirit this week. We didn't coordinate with you at all, and just couldn't help but notice how great those songs went with our text this morning. So, the Holy Spirit is at work. We're excited about that. Matthew 16 is our text. And I'm going to just begin with this statement. Three statements I want to give you this morning. Three very important statements. This first one is this. It matters who we believe Jesus is. And I mean that on a corporate level as we think about Deerfield Bible Church as a whole. But I mean that also individually. It matters this morning who every single one of you in this room says Jesus is. I'm not going to ask you to say this out loud, but I want you to think this thought. It matters who I think Jesus is. Think that thought. It matters who I think Jesus is. It matters beyond what I think you and I even could imagine. It matters. Jesus in Matthew chapter 16, I'm kind of picking up in the middle of the thought here, but Jesus is gathered with his disciples. He's in the area of Caesarea Philippi. We're picking up in verse 14, and Jesus asks this question of the disciples that are around him. And if Jesus is asking the question, it's an important question. Listen to what he says to his disciples. Who do the people say that I am? Jesus isn't right now talking about his disciples. He's talking about the crowd. Who do those around us? We've been traveling around. I've been doing miracles. I've been teaching. I've been meeting with people. You guys have interacted with these people. You've gotten a sense of where they are, what they believe, what they think, and Jesus wants to know, who do these people think that I am? Who are they saying that I am? Well, Jesus isn't looking for accolades. This isn't a popularity contest for Jesus. Jesus is looking to know the spiritual pulse of the crowds around him. His disciples who have gathered with those people and spoken with them and spent time with them have a sense of what is going on. And this is what they respond to Jesus. Verse 14. And they said, some say, Jesus, that you are John the Baptist. Others say that you are Elijah. Others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Now here we are in New Testament times. We're on the other side of, in terms of, some of you may or may not know, the Old Testament was before Jesus came. 39 books of the Old Testament before Jesus came. 27 books of the New Testament after Jesus has come to earth. We're in that second half. We're in that New Testament period. And for the entire Old Testament period, Jesus, the Messiah, they didn't know his name, but he had been awaited by God's people. They were anxiously, for 4,000 years of human history, God's people, Paul says it in Corinthians, we see through a glass kind of dimly. They didn't understand fully what was going to happen, but they had awaited some sort of Messiah. They had awaited somebody who was going to come and rescue them in some way. And they didn't understand it. They didn't get it completely. But they had awaited this. And Jesus wants to know have they got the clue here? Have they got the sense that that's who I am? Instead, the disciples say that some of them think you're John the Baptist. Well, John the Baptist is dead and gone. He says some of them think that you are Elijah. Elijah is dead and gone. Some of them think you're Jeremiah, although also dead and gone, although there were some who believed that Jeremiah never died because we don't have a record of his death, and so maybe this was Jesus who had just kind of lived on, and now he's, or Jeremiah, and he's reappeared to us. Now, on the one hand, the people have really missed who Jesus is. And they have reduced him to something significantly smaller than he actually is. But on the other hand, we recognize that they do see Jesus as significantly different, than everyone else. Because they think, well, maybe this is John the Baptist come back from the dead. Well, who thinks that? Why would they draw that conclusion? Jesus was different. So although they're understanding Jesus to be not exactly who he says he is, not accurate, they do see Jesus as someone greater, better, more important, more impressive than those around them. Elijah, a great prophet. Many stories have been passed down about Elijah's ministry. Jeremiah, a great prophet. So I look at that and I think, isn't that really similar to the way sometimes Jesus is viewed today? He's not just an ordinary man, and I'm talking in the church, and sometimes outside the church, he's not just an ordinary man. We don't lump him in with just regular everyday people. Here they're lumping him in with somebody, maybe he's raised from the dead. We read over and over again that people were impressed with Jesus' teaching as he spoke with one who had authority. He had done miracles and he was different. But I think, how similar is that to the way sometimes the church views Jesus? Certainly better than everybody else. Simply not an accurate picture of who he really is. There are some today, in fact, who see and emphasize, from a corporate church perspective, the teachings of Jesus. We recognize as we open up God's Word, man, he says some stuff that nobody else says, and it's with authority, and it's powerful, and it's life-changing. And so there's an emphasis, man, Jesus was a great teacher. There are others today who speak of Jesus' miracles and emphasize that aspect of Jesus. He is a miracle worker. And there were those who followed Jesus just because he was a miracle worker. They were impressed by that. And today there are some who emphasize that part of him. The miracles that he did. The fact that he can do things that go beyond the scope of the natural. There are others who were just impressed by Jesus. They loved it when he would kind of put the Pharisees in their place. They loved the spectacle of watching him feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. Jesus was, I guess you could put it this way, kind of the biggest show in town. And today there are a lot of churches, and there's a lot of emphasis on these characteristics of Jesus. What an incredible teacher. What an incredible miracle worker. What an incredible show, if you will, can be built around this man, Jesus. But as great as that picture is of Jesus, it's really missing the point. In fact, if you and I were to miss who Jesus really is, which we're going to get to this morning, if we were to miss who Jesus really is, we can spend every single Sunday talking about the teachings of Jesus. And as powerful as they are, they wouldn't do anything for us. You and I, if we were to miss who Jesus really is, and to emphasize just the fact that he wants to heal and he wants to do miracles in our lives, again, if we miss who he really is, none of that will be of any value to us, at least not from an eternal perspective. If we were to join the bandwagon of so many today who make Sunday morning just a spectacle, a show, a time that attracts people by appealing to their flesh, we could perhaps get a big crowd, a really big crowd. But if we miss who Jesus really is, then that's all that it will be. A show that we attend and we go home and wait for the next entertainment to begin. It matters who we believe Jesus is. It matters as a church. And people, it matters for you individually. Who do you believe Jesus is? Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. A good man, an impressive man, but missing the significance. Jesus then asked the question in verse 15, but who do you say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Peter, who tends to be the spokesperson of the disciples most regularly, responds here in verse number 16. Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is significant. This is huge because Peter has spent the same amount of time, in fact, more time with Jesus than these crowds have. He's seen the same miracles. He's heard the same teachings. He's seen the same impressive spectacle that at times Jesus was, and I mean it in a positive way, and yet Peter did not respond. Jesus, you are an incredible teacher. You're a prophet. You're a miracle worker. You're impressive. Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus, you are the one. I just want to illustrate this. You are the one that for 4,000 years, or whenever God began to speak to his people, 4,000 years of human history, somewhere in that point, he began to give them this message that I am going to send the Messiah. It was clouded. It was clouded in Genesis when he told them that the Eve or the human race would crush or bruise, that the devil would bruise the heel of the human race, but that this Messiah would crush. He would crush the devil. Very, very clouded. They didn't get it. But for all of these years of human history, there was this promise. And grandfathers would pass it down to their grandkids. And then those kids would pass it down to their kids. Somebody's coming. Something's happening. God's sending someone to us. We see it clouded in that picture of Abraham as he brings his son Isaac up on the mountain because God says, I want you to sacrifice him. And he brings him up ready to sacrifice him. And God sends this ram in this thicket just as Abraham was about to do it. And again, a picture of this Messiah that was going to come. And they had no idea what it was going to look like. But have you ever looked forward to something? Like really looked forward to something? And it's all you can think about. And there are some times when I'm really looking forward to something and it just seems like nothing else matters. I'll be at work and I don't even care that I'm at work because this thing's about to happen. This wonderful thing's about to take place and you look forward to it. And the anticipation has built for all of these years. And now it has finally taken place. But here's the problem. For all of those years, do you know they were false prophets? Do you know they were false messiahs? There were those who said, I'm the one. Just like today, there are those. Remember David Koresh over in Waco, Texas? I'm the one. I'm the Messiah. The same thing happened then. And so it is hugely significant here that Peter says, here we are. You, Jesus, you're the Christ. You are that word is Christos. It means anointed one. It means Messiah, the sent one. You are the one that God sent, that we have been waiting for. Right answer. Ding, ding, ding. Right answer. I am the Messiah. I am the sent one. Jesus made the claim that ultimately put him on the cross. Listen what Jesus said to him. Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. You know what that reminds us of? It reminds us of the miracle of salvation. Did you know, if you know Christ here this morning, that there is nothing in your flesh that would have drawn you to him? In fact, everything in our flesh would have caused us to run from Jesus. Because Jesus calls us to this place of coming and dying. He calls us to this place of surrender. He calls us to give up everything that our flesh is passionate about. And so in our flesh, we will not do that. That, people, by the way, is the problem with the modern church today. They are trying to build the church through fleshly means. Let's attract them by all kinds of things that appeal to our natural person, our flesh. But see, the problem is when somebody comes, quote, to Christ through the flesh, they don't really come to Christ. Because we don't come to Christ through the flesh. We come to Christ through the miracle of the Holy Spirit who draws us. And when Jesus said to Peter, this is incredible, this isn't something that flesh and blood brought you to this realization. What he's saying is this is something that God has brought in your heart to open up the eyes of your heart to bring you to this truth. You didn't come up with it, Peter, on your own. You didn't sit down one day and just think logically this makes sense. You didn't notice it because other people around you were observing it. You didn't notice it as you looked at me, my flesh and blood. Isaiah, in fact, prophesied about the day when Jesus would come. And Isaiah says this about him. He had no form, he had no majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. There was nothing about Jesus' appearance that you looked at and said, man, that's the Messiah. There was no halo. There was no big bright light that surrounded him. In fact, the Bible tells us that his own people, the town that he came from, rejected him as Messiah. He was the unlikely one. He didn't look kingly. He didn't have the stature that they would have expected. This was a miracle. And if you know Jesus Christ here this morning, you know him because God is doing miracles. And he has done a miracle of salvation in your heart. We need to remember that. We need to remember that. Because when we introduce people to the gospel, to the message of Jesus Christ, our temptation is to somehow dumb it down, somehow make it look pretty, somehow appeal to that fleshly instinct that we have. Because why would anybody come to this? And we need to remember, no, God, this is you. This is you that draw people. This is you that open up eyes and open up hearts. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. It matters who we believe Jesus is. Number one. Number two is this. It matters who Jesus actually is. Not only does it matter who we believe he is, it actually matters who he actually is. And you might hear that, well, duh, that's a no-brainer. Of course it does. Is this clock right? You're just looking at this clock. This one correct? Yeah. Okay. It matters who he actually is. A couple years ago, we were in Vermont, and we were doing a corn maze that we do every fall. And we had been there for many years, and I had never shared Jesus with the owner of that corn maze. And he's always just kind of standing around, giving us clues of where we should go. And on this particular day, before I even got there, I felt convicted. I wanted to share Jesus with this guy. And so I put a tract in my pocket, and I knew that at one point we're going to be up on this bridge talking about where we should be going and giving us clues. And I wanted to capitalize on that. And I believe his name was Mike. And I said, Mike, you know what? I have to apologize to you. I've been coming to this maze for a lot of years. And I know your name and you know my name. And I have never shared the most important thing in my life with you. I began to share Jesus with him, and he immediately shut me down. He said, I don't want to hear it. And this was his statement to me, or his reasoning behind it. He said, I look around and I see religions all over the place. I see faith systems, belief systems. He says, I look at all that and I just said, what makes yours the right one? Why is yours the right one? In fact, he wouldn't even take a tract from me. He said, I'm not going to take it because I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to read it. Well, I responded to this guy the same way that I respond to everybody who asked that question. I said, well, Jesus is not just who he says he is because he said it. I said he is who he says he is because he demonstrated it. I said because Jesus came to this earth to die for the sins of the world. And he actually died, he actually was buried, and he actually rose again from the dead. And that is a historical fact, I told this guy. And I said, you got other belief systems, other religions, and they believe what they believe, and they can believe it with all of their heart. But it doesn't make a difference if it's not true. I didn't say this to him, but we live in a world where there are millions of Muslims who believe certain things about their prophet Muhammad. They believe certain things about their, quote, God, Allah. And they believe them with every ounce of who they are. but they're not true. And there's no evidence that they've ever been true. And no matter how hard they believe it, they're not going to end up with the eternity that they think that they're going to end up with. There are cults in our world with the same kind of things being taught and promoted, and it doesn't matter how hard they believe them, how intently and sincerely they believe them. If it's not true, it doesn't make a difference. And you and I, not only does it matter what we believe about Jesus or who we believe He is, but we also need to understand that it matters who Jesus actually is. I don't want to believe something that's not true. Paul actually put it this way. He said, the reason why you and I will be raised is because Christ was raised. Why do I have such confidence that someday I'm going to be in heaven with God? Because Jesus died and rose again and said that He's going to bring me with Him in this resurrection. Amen. Paul went on to say, he says, man, if we're wrong about this, you know what Paul said about us? He said, we ought to be pitied above everybody else. He said, we are the most miserable people on the planet if we are wrong. Why? Because we've allowed this belief system to alter every corner of our lives. What a waste if we are wrong. So it doesn't just matter who we believe Jesus is. It matters who Jesus actually is. And people, we can rejoice here this morning. Because the tomb is empty. Because someday we're going to see Jesus Christ face to face. That's not theory. That's not make-believe. That's a fact. Because Jesus Christ rose from the dead, Paul says, even so will He bring all those with Him who are in Jesus Christ. It matters who Jesus is. It matters who we believe He is. It matters who He actually is. He's the sent one. He is the Messiah. He is the one that God had promised for generation after generation after generation. We don't believe that in blind faith. I hope that you understand that. People have said that to me, oh, you and your blind, you have this blind faith. There's nothing blind about my faith. My faith is built on an empty tomb. My faith is built upon a historical character named Jesus Christ, who the guards who guarded Him at the tomb were told, put some more guards around that tomb so we can be sure that nobody steals the body. All kinds of measures were put in place to make sure that this whole Jesus talk 2,000 years ago would be squelched with His death. And yet, after His death, Christianity took off and blew up and turned the world upside down for Jesus Christ. Why is that? Because Jesus rose from the dead and because He was seen by over 500 people at one time. We don't have blind faith. I believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, because Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. That was a really good place for amen. Thank you. It matters who we believe Jesus is. It matters who Jesus actually is. Third point, it matters, people listen, because this is where the rubber meets the road. It matters who we proclaim Jesus to be. Listen, we can believe it in here, and we can recognize that it is a fact. But where the rubber meets the road is when you and I get commissioned by God to proclaim that message. And if you are born again here this morning, you've been commissioned. Listen to what Colossians says. This is talking about Jesus. Powerful verse. He is before all things. And in Him, all things hold together. Listen, if you know Jesus Christ here this morning, your salvation is secure. You're on your way to heaven. You've been sealed until the day of redemption. And answer this question out loud. Who is it that's holding you together? Jesus. I'm going to ask it again because that was really lame. If you know Jesus Jesus Christ, your salvation is secure. You're going to see Jesus Christ someday face to face. You've been sealed until the day of redemption by the Holy Spirit. Who's holding you together? Jesus! That's right. Amen. Amen. Listen. Deerfield Bible Church, corporately, is a church that I believe God is building. Who is it? Who is it that's building Deerfield Bible Church? Jesus is building Deerfield Bible Church. And we don't want anything less. I don't want Jesus as just a great teacher. I don't want Jesus as just a great miracle worker. I don't want him as a spectacle. I want Jesus Christ as the Son of the living God. The Son of the Christ, the Messiah. Because I would. Because all that I can give you is Jesus Christ. Listen to what verse 18 says. I tell you, Peter, I tell you, you are Peter. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Peter, listen, this is an incredible thing. You didn't figure this out on your own. God revealed this to you. And he says, Peter, you are this. And there's a lot of confusion about this next verse. The Catholic Church has totally missed the mark on this. The church was never intended to be built on Peter. It says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Here's what it actually says in the Greek. Peter, you are Petros. Anybody know what a Petros is? Pebble. It's a pebble. It's a little rock. It sounds like, if you just read this verse at face value, Peter, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. The church was never meant to be built on Peter any more than it was meant to be built on you or me or Billy Graham or anybody else. It says, Peter, in fact, this verse says just the opposite. It says, Peter, you are Petros. You're a little pebble. It wasn't a rebuke. It wasn't a put down. You're a rock. And he didn't call him a marshmallow. He says, you're a rock. But Peter, on this Petra, that's the next word. Upon this rock, this Petra, which is a boulder. It's huge. It's immovable. I am going to build my church. What was the Petra? What's Jesus referring to? On Jesus Christ, and more specifically on the profession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He says to Peter, Peter, this is great. It's been revealed to you. You're a little rock. You're a little pebble. And I am going to build my church on this truth, this profession that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. And I'll tell you, wherever the church is being built, and I'm not talking about numbers, I'm not talking about churches with 5, 10, 15, 20,000. That's not a sign of whether or not the church is being built. Numbers is not a sign. I'm talking about where the church is being built, where people are coming to faith in Jesus Christ, where they're being baptized into a relationship with Him, where they're being discipled, where they're growing into Christ's likeness. That's what it means to build a church. It is being built on one thing and one thing only, and it is this truth that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Anywhere else that we see church, quote, growth happening, if it is not built on that, then it is not the building of the church. It is building of something that is entirely, or at least majority, fleshly in nature. Jesus points out two things here. He says, I will build whose church? His church. My church. Whose church is Deerfield Bible Church? It's Jesus' church. I build houses for a living. And every now and then, I get opportunity to give input, but for the most part, people already have in mind what they want. And I come there, and my thought is the customer's always right, even if they're wrong. And every now and then, in fact, this happened to me a couple weeks ago, some people wanted something that I have never done before. And I know it's going to look ugly, and it's done now, and it does look ugly. So I said, sure. Why? Because it's your house. Because when Jesus says, this is my house, I don't need your counsel. I don't need your advice. This is not a practice run for me. I know exactly what I'm doing. And I have authority to do it. This is my church. And I'm going to do it my way. I pray often. I say, Lord, I just want to find out what you're doing. And I just want to join you in it. Because I am so prone to figuring out what I want to do and running with it. I said, Lord, I do not want to do that. what are you doing here in Deerfield, New Hampshire? I just want to join you in what you're doing because this is your thing. And I don't want to do it my way. I want to do it your way because God's way, God's things done God's way produces God's kind of results. And that's what I want. It did not exclude Peter from responsibility. Peter, upon this truth, upon this profession, I will build my church. But Peter, who's going to be the one to profess it? Who's going to be the one to proclaim it? Peter. And those disciples gathered around him. It doesn't exclude you and I. The church isn't built on us. But God requires that you and I be the people who proclaim that profession. Who preach and teach and live that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's our responsibility. So although the church is not being built on us, it's a reminder that we do have a responsibility. We're a tool in God's hand to use what God has given to us to build it. Listen, I could build houses with nails and hammers and nail guns and bolts and lumber, or for a little while, I could probably pull it off with some duct tape and some Elmer's wood glue. Give me the tools, and I'll do my best to do it. But I know that the only house that's actually going to stand is the one that is going to be using the right tools, the right equipment, the right fasteners. You want a house built out of duct tape or held together with duct tape? I probably won't do it. But if I did, I'd say, well, I'll go for it. But it's not going to last. Listen to what 1 Corinthians 3 says. Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but God gives the growth. You and I are just tools in God's hands. I have a saying in the back of my Bible I wrote a long time ago that says, no one is greater than the cause. No person in this room is greater than the cause. The cause is to lift up the name of Jesus Christ as the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And no person is greater than that cause. We're just tools. And the church cannot be built, as it is so often, around the person who gives the most money or speaks the loudest or complains the most. No one is greater than the cause. Paul says this, neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. For he who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it. Take care how we build upon what God is already beginning to do here. How do we build upon this? Now that it's been started with Christ, the Son of the living God, do we want to now take it over by flesh and introduce a bunch of flesh? No, we don't want to do that. Take care how you build upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest. For the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. We have the option. Not that God gives us the option, but we can take it. We can build with gold, with silver, with precious stones. We can build with wood, with hay, and with straw. It's kind of like the three little pigs. One that built with what sticks, one built with straw, and one built with stone. Only one of them stood, right? Only one of them stood when the big bad wolf huffed and puffed and he blew the other two down. It is so tempting because the response and the results, fleshly speaking, are so impressive when we build out of wood and hay and stubble. But it does not last. What's the point? What's the point of building with anything but gold and silver and precious stones? An implication of building on the profession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. On this rock I will build my church. And then he says this. He says, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. There's a lot of confusion about this verse as well. Here's what I think Jesus is saying here. Not unlike our culture, minus the gates, we have figurative gates. In Jesus' day, in Jesus' culture, gates would surround the city. And it was within the walls and the gates of that city that all of the planning and all of the strategies and all of the scheming of how to protect that city, of how to make that city great, all of that took place within the confines of those walls and in the confines of those gates. That's where it took place. And how many of you know that right now there is a city, so to speak, that has walls and gates around it in which the devil presides, and he is presently working on schemes and deceptions and plans to destroy you and to destroy Deerfield Bible Church. Right now, there is again, a figurative city, but we know that God has given the devil over for a period of time, some authority, some rule to do what he wants to do. And the devil is presiding in his city, behind his gates, scheming against you and scheming against me and scheming against Deerfield Bible Church. And Jesus says this. He says, upon this profession that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God, I will build my church, and all that the devil has planned will just be a big waste of time. How many of you want to make the devil's job a big waste of time? I sure do. We live in a world where there are plans and schemes, and we know that the devil is behind it, but we know that you and I will get the brunt of it. You and I will experience the force of it all. We live in a world where all that we want to do, all that we believe in, all that we hold precious is being undermined, is being legislated against, is being voted against. It's a reminder to us. It's a reminder to us. There's a gate, there are walls, that the devil is within there scheming against us. I wrote this down primarily as a reminder for myself. No outside force can or will defeat or destroy God's church. The counsels of man and secularism will try and are trying, but time has proven that their attempts only result in proving the church, separating the sheep from the goats and growing the real thing. You ever notice that historically that oppression and pressure from those gates of hell have never accomplished what they've wanted to accomplish? The church has grown. The church has flourished. In parts of the world right now where it is illegal to know Jesus Christ, there are thousands and millions of people coming to know Jesus Christ. Listen to this passage from Acts chapter 8. On that day, a great persecution rose against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered through the region of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church and entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Do you hear that? They didn't just run and hide. They didn't go into a cave. The gates of hell are prevailing or pushing against the church. Not prevailing, but pushing against the church. They didn't run and hide. It says those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Philip went down to Samaria, proclaimed to them the Christ. The multitudes with one accord gave heed to what was being said by Philip when they heard him and saw the signs which he did. For unclean spirits came out of many who were possessed, crying with a loud voice, and many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was much joy in that city. The gates of hell can push all they want. People, you and I have one job. To proclaim with our words and to proclaim with our lives that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And the devil can bring it on because he's not battling us. He's battling the Christ, the Son of the living God. Tertullian said the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. I got a kick out of this. I learned this many years ago. Voltaire, the philosopher, once said that within 100 years of his death, that the Bible would be obsolete. Nobody would have one, and it would be gone. You know what actually happened? Within 50 years of his death, the Geneva Bible Society bought his house and began printing Bibles from inside his house. The gates of hell attempting to prevail against God's work. And God, as only He could do it, just kind of laughing. I'll have my way Voltaire. I'm going to jump down to this. It's a great question that sometimes people ask. If that is true, if the gates of hell will not prevail, then why do we see the church in so many places struggling? Why do we see the church in some parts of the world diminishing, at least the visibleness of that church? Why do we see mega churches? Why? It's a great question. Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Jesus said that there is no outside force that can come into the church and can destroy it. But you know where the church gets destroyed?
From the inside.
From the inside. That's where the church gets destroyed. There's a great story that I think illustrates this. During the siege of Madrid in the Spanish Civil War, Emilio Mola was about to attack that city, and it was known that he had 4 columns. He called them columns, 4 groups of people who had surrounded that city and who were going to attack. And he was asked, which one of your 4 columns will be victorious over that city? And his response was, the 5th one. What nobody knew, except for this general and his soldiers, was that he had already placed a 5th column within the gates of that city. They had begun to mingle. They had begun to familiarize themselves with the people, and the people had familiarized themselves with them. And he said, those will be the ones that take down this city. You know where the church gets destroyed? Now listen, ultimately, don't misunderstand me. There will always be a remnant, and the church will not be destroyed. It will not be prevailed against. But in those little pockets of our world where we see what appears to be happening, the destruction of the church, it's not happening from outside. It's happening because people within the church say, I will not proclaim that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. I will not teach it. We will not stand for it as a church. We will not live it. And it's a cancer. When that happens, it's a cancer that goes and flows through the church. That is why it becomes imperative that you and I, that this leadership here at this church, keep close tabs on that cancer. Because listen, I don't have to be voicing that I don't believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. I can just live in it. And if I just live that He's not, I am a cancer within this body that will spread. But ultimately, I wrote in big letters, there is always a remnant. You remember Elijah battled against the 400 prophets of Baal and has this incredible victory by God, and ultimately comes down and finds out that Jezebel wants to kill him, and he's freaking out, and I'm the only one left on planet Earth who loves God. God says, no, I've reserved 12,000 people. There's 12,000 people who have not bent the knee. And I want you to know something here. Deerfield Bible Church is committed to being that remnant. Deerfield Bible Church is committed to being that remnant that preaches that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. When we did that journey wall out here in this back room, I was just so encouraged to see that God has gathered a group of people, leaders, but also just people like you who have come in because you are serious about the Word of God. You are serious about that profession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And by God's grace, Deerfield Bible Church will continue until Jesus comes to be a place where Jesus is preached as the Christ, the Son of the living God. I've been telling you all this because it's very easy to fall into the trap of 2 things. One, to think that this is not me, but you, me. We could all say, this is my church. This is my church. I had a conversation with a guy many years ago that the church we were at before, some changes were taking place that I believe were biblical changes. And he was all mad about them. And I approached him one day and I said, what's the problem? Why are you fighting all of these biblical changes? And his words to me were, this is my church. So easy to fall into that trap. Change is difficult. Change is hard. But this is God's church. And He's going to do what He wants to do here. The second trap that's part of that is, it's my church and I'm going to build it my way. No. This is God's church. And we're going to just be tools in His hands to build it His way. As you know, Deerfield Bible Church has had just God's blessed us. I think of 7 years ago almost when we came, and I'll be honest with you, well, I came on as an intern, and I thought, well, this will be 3 or 4 months. And then 7 years almost went by. But I'll tell you, I'll just be forthright with you here. I remember thinking, is God really going to do anything in Deerfield? I mean, we don't have, from a fleshly standpoint, we don't have a lot to offer. We're kind of out here in the middle of nowhere. You got to travel half an hour to get to anywhere here. I was thinking fleshly, and I thought, we don't have rock climbing walls. We don't have kids programs. And we don't have Sunday school. And we don't have all the things that sometimes attract people. And I wondered, is God ever going to do something in Deerfield? I think this church is a testimony to Matthew chapter 16. Upon this profession, I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. I will build my church, because people, that's really all we have. And God has used that to build His church. We've seen growth that I think exceeds all of our, at least mine. I can speak for myself, and I think for most of us. I had a friend who I was sharing with a while back, and I was just sharing with him the first 5 years of Deerfield Bible Church, I felt were a breeze, just comparatively speaking. Last couple of years, I felt were a little bit more challenging. And I said to him, and his name is Josh, he's a pastor friend of mine, and I said, Josh, I don't know what's going on. It's become much more of a challenge as the church has grown. And he shared an illustration with me that just really nailed it. He had read a book in which he said that the church is like an animal, or animals. He said, when a church is anywhere from 10 to 50 people, your church is a cat. How many know a cat? They're pretty independent, right? They don't need a lot of help. You can put out a bowl of food for a week with a bowl of water. And you can leave and come back, and they might not even notice that you're back. They didn't notice you were gone. That's a church from 10 to 50. Not a lot of needs. Not a lot of responsibility from a leadership perspective. Just almost runs on its own. Of course, we know it's God doing that. But he said a church from 51 to 100 becomes a dog. How many can leave a bowl of cereal, food out and water out for a dog and think that your dog is not going to hate you at the end of the week? It becomes a whole different animal. Dogs need, this is not a negative thing, this is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing that God has brought our church from a cat to a dog. We have more needs because we have more people. We have more needs because more people want to know Christ. We have more needs because we've got a variety. We've got kids of all ages and right up through to Lynn Harris, who's 92 almost. That's a great thing. But we've become a dog. We've become a church that needs more care. We want to build this church, or we want God to build this church in the way that He wants to build it. And I look at what God has done in 7 years, and I am so encouraged by the last few notes on that journey wall. The last few notes that Sam Hubbard told us to put on were yellow, and he said, I want you to put on your vision for Deerfield Bible Church. And I jotted a couple of those down. Some people put down, I want to see more people discipled. I want to see more people reached with the truth in this particular town, in this locale. I want to see more people baptized and being saved. Some people even put on, I want to see us build a big addition. And I don't believe that was about numbers as much as it's just about, we just want to see God do a good thing, a great thing, a great good thing. And I believe that Deerfield Bible Church has more potential than even what God has already begun to do. And so here's the deal. Deerfield Bible Church has grown. Deerfield Bible Church is in a place where we need to continue to grow, and we need to provide for that growth. And the eldership for a couple of months now has been discussing, we've been talking, and God is doing something. We don't want to squelch that. We don't want to stop that. We don't want to do anything that would hold that back. And we have come to, after much prayer and much counsel from God's Word, we have come together to the conclusion that it is time for Deerfield Bible Church to hire a full-time pastor. And if you don't like change, that could be a very negative thing. I think it's super exciting because I never imagined that Deerfield Bible Church would be at the place where, wow, we just can't take care of the needs. We need to hire a full-time pastor. And so we are in the process. We've been meeting with Sam Hubbard and discussing all of the details of that. But we are in the process now of beginning that next wonderful, exciting stage of Deerfield Bible Church. I had a friend, and I thought he put this very delicately but very well. He said, I told him that we were doing this. He said, Rusty, I think that's a great idea. He's a pastor. And I said, why is that? And he said, don't take this wrong. He said, but no matter how hard you try not to do this, he said, a church tends to be built around the preacher. He said, you become the daddy figure of that church. And he said, with you working full-time, with you living 35 minutes away, he said, I think that you're an absent daddy. And he said, you can't grow a church with an absent daddy. And I thought he put it very well. We need to have somebody here who can shepherd this church 24/7. I work almost full-time, and that just doesn't work. And I believe with all of my heart that we're going to squelch the growth of this church if we continue to try to do with 90 people what we did with 40. It just doesn't work that way. And so I think this is a very exciting thing that we have as a possibility, as a move toward. And I believe that God is going to use this move to grow this church even far beyond where we see it now and where we are now. I want to just very quickly, I know we're just about out of time here, I want to tell you what the plan is. Sam Hubbard is recommending that we take on an intern for the transitional phase. That is tentatively the plan, unless God, of course, just drop the perfect person in our lap. We would take on an intern who would be here for that transition, and I would remain on as an elder for that transitional phase. Personally, my desire, if as God provides us with a new pastor, is I would love to be to him what Scott and Bob and David have been for me. That person that fills in when I just cannot do it. So I will continue to preach on a somewhat regular basis, but the primary preaching role would come from him. Sam Hubbard is recommending a 6-month approximately interim period for an interim before we take on a pastor, just to provide, just so we don't rush the process. We have already filled out a profile with the EFCA, which is kind of like a Christian mingle thing for pastors. And because I want you to know, and this is why I preach from Matthew 16, we are committed to allowing God to build this church. And I can promise you, and I can speak for every one of us as elders, we will not tolerate, we will not even consider a person standing up here preaching who does not have as his only goal to preach Jesus Christ crucified. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Son of the living God. So we would take our time to do that process. We will have to make some adjustments to the budget to make that happen. Presently, we have a lot of giving going to missions. We have a challenge that a pastor is actually a missionary. He becomes the new missionary, so we would, unfortunately, initially have to back off from our missions budget in order to accommodate that. But of course, the goal is that the church grows, and then we can then give back to that funding where we were at one point before. Of course, the question becomes, what's our involvement? What do we do in all of this? I want you to know that ultimately Hebrews 13 says that the elders will be responsible for this leadership position. That's an elder responsibility. But we want to involve you in that process. We will be asking your input. We will be giving you a profile. Not necessarily to follow it. If you say you just want somebody that's really handsome and buff, that's not going to be on our criteria list. But we'll give you a profile because we want to know what, I know that sometimes the different styles are a little bit easier to receive than others. So we'll be getting your input in regards to that. And I would ask that you just pray like crazy. Pray your heart out. We want to, there's a church locally that has taken a pastor, and God just gave him the right guy. And that church is just taken off. And the church isn't built on a person, but God uses people. That's just what he does. He uses people. And so I'll just ask that you pray like crazy. Again, we'll be giving you the survey and walking you through each part of that process. We want to give you as much involvement in that as we possibly can, with the exception of making the final decision, because that not only is part of our bylaws, but our bylaws come from Hebrews 13, which say that this is an elder responsibility. So it's an exciting thing. I know it's late, but I just want to give you a couple minutes. Do you have questions in regards to this? Any questions? Well, that's great. Let me ask you, yeah, Mary.
So, what's your position on cloning?
I'd love to address that. Can we address that on a different Sunday, though? I will. Let's address that. But specific questions to, thank you for that. That was great. To this transition, yeah.
Have you ever considered changing your life to become our next pastor?
I have prayed about that. She asked, have I ever considered changing my path to become the pastor? And I have prayed about that. I've thought about that. I'm just going to be outright, which is forthright with you. It's not where my heart is. It's just not really where my heart is. I love preaching. I didn't preach last week, and 2 weeks went by, and this morning I was just aching to get up here and preach. I love it, but that's what I am. I'm a preacher, and I do not believe that God has made me a pastor. And it's a very different gifting. It's a very different gifting. And really, the ideal pastor biblically is one who is a preacher/pastor. Bob Crabb is a pastor, which, by the way, in this transition, Bob is going to take an official title as shepherding pastor. In case you have questions, in case you have concerns, he will be the one to address those. But it's a very different gifting. You can no more put a preacher into a pastor position than you can a mercy person or a non-mercy person into a mercy position. It doesn't fit. It's like the little blocks that you put into the thing, and the sizes, the shapes don't fit. God didn't make me that, and I'm open to Him changing that in me, but it's just not where my heart is. I love to preach, just not a pastor.
Because when I give testimony about Jesus Christ, and they ask me which church do I go to, and I tell them here, I am so surprised because they say they've heard about this church. They've heard that the preacher is on fire for God in this church. And that some really wonderful things are going on in this church.
Yeah.
And it always, takes me surprised because we're a little church,
Sure.
out here in Deerfield. And
Yeah.
they heard about us.
Yeah. And she said, she hears people, she tells people she goes to Deerfield Bible Church, and they say, I heard about that church, and heard about things that are happening there, the preacher and so on. And so I think you bring up a great point, because what we want people to hear about Deerfield Bible Church, in 1 Thessalonians, Paul said, I don't even need to tell anybody about you guys, how you came to faith and turned from idols to serve the living God, and the word has spread everywhere. That's what we want. But what we don't want is for it to happen solely. She said, people say, I hear about that preacher and he's on fire for God. What we want is people say, I hear about that, I want to, and I'm tired. And I'll tell you what, you give me the opportunity to have somebody filling this role more regularly. And when I get up here, I'll preach you like I've never preached before.
I'd just like to take this opportunity to say thank you.
That's what Meredith's comment meant. She didn't really want to know about
I know, yes, I know. It's turning us in a different direction. Nothing really matters except, God, you're in control. That's all that matters. We can rest in that. The details don't matter. We just want to submit to Him. Could a couple people pray to close us, and then we'll do this.
the messages that you brought through Runcie